The morning sun was bright over John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City. Travelers moved through the busy terminal, pulling suitcases behind them and checking their phones for gate numbers. It was a Tuesday morning and the airport was filled with business people heading to meetings and families starting their vacations. At Gate 24, passengers were beginning to board Flight 447 to Los Angeles. The airplane was a large Boeing 777 and today it was completely full. First-class passengers were called to board first, as they always were. They walked down the jet bridge with their carry-on bags, ready to settle into their comfortable seats for the 6-hour flight across the country. Among these first-class passengers was a man in his late 40s. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit with a crisp white shirt. His leather shoes were polished to a shine. On his wrist was a simple but elegant watch. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and pulled a small black rolling suitcase with the other. Everything about him spoke of success and professionalism. The man walked calmly down the narrow aisle of the airplane. He had flown this route dozens of times before. He knew exactly where his seat was located. Seat 2A, a window seat in the second row of first class. He had specifically chosen this seat when he booked his ticket 3 weeks earlier. As he reached his row, he lifted his suitcase into the overhead bin. The movement was smooth and practiced. He had done this countless times. He then placed his briefcase under the seat in front of him and prepared to sit down. "Excuse me, sir." A voice came from behind him. It was sharp and cold. The man turned around. A flight attendant stood in the aisle. She was a woman in her mid-30s with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her uniform was neat, but her face showed no warmth. Her arms were crossed over her chest. "Yes?" The man replied politely. "Can I help you with something?" "I need to see your boarding pass," the flight attendant said. Her tone was not friendly. It was demanding. The man looked slightly confused. This was unusual. Flight attendants typically checked boarding passes at the gate, not after passengers had already boarded and found their seats. But he remained calm and reached into his jacket pocket. "Of course," he said. He pulled out his phone and opened his boarding pass on the screen. He held it out for her to see. The flight attendant barely glanced at it. "This seat is for first-class passengers only," she said. Her voice was loud enough that several nearby passengers turned to look. "Yes, I know," the man said calmly. "That's why I'm sitting here. This is my seat, 2A, as you can see on my boarding pass." "There must be some kind of mistake," the flight attendant insisted. She did not look at his boarding pass again. Instead, she stared at him with suspicious eyes. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" The man's expression changed slightly. A small line appeared between his eyebrows. He was beginning to understand what was happening, but he kept his voice steady and professional. "I'm quite sure," he said. "I booked this seat myself. I have a first-class ticket. Would you like to see it again?" Other passengers were now openly watching. An elderly woman across the aisle frowned at the flight attendant. A young couple in the row behind whispered to each other. Someone in row 4 quietly pulled out their phone. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me," the flight attendant said. Her voice was even louder now. "We need to sort this out." "Sort what out?" the man asked. His calm was impressive, but there was a firmness in his voice now. "I have a valid ticket. I am sitting in my assigned seat. There is nothing to sort out." The flight attendant's face turned red. "Sir, please don't make this difficult. I'm just doing my job. And I'm just sitting in the seat I paid for," the man replied. "I fly this airline every week. I have elite status. My boarding pass clearly shows seat 2A in first class." "What exactly is the problem?" More passengers were pulling out their phones now. The woman across the aisle spoke up. "I saw him board with the first-class group," she said loudly. "He has every right to be here." The flight attendant shot her an annoyed look. "Ma'am, please stay out of this. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," said a man in row 3. "You're holding up the boarding process." The businessman remained standing in the aisle. He had not raised his voice once. His face showed patience, but his eyes revealed his frustration. He knew exactly what was happening. This was not about his ticket. This was not about his seat assignment. This was about something else entirely. "I would like to speak to your supervisor," he said clearly. It was not a request. It was a statement. The flight attendant's jaw tightened. "Fine," she snapped. "Stay right here. Don't sit down." She turned and walked quickly toward the front of the plane. The man remained standing in the aisle. Several passengers gave him sympathetic looks. The elderly woman shook her head in disgust. The young couple behind him looked uncomfortable, unsure of what to do. "This is ridiculous," someone muttered from the back of the first-class cabin. The man said nothing. He simply stood there waiting. His face was calm, but inside his heart was beating faster. He had experienced situations like this before, though never quite so publicly. He thought about all the times he had been followed in stores. All the times security had stopped him in office buildings where he actually worked. All the times people had assumed he couldn't afford something or didn't belong somewhere. Today it was happening again. But this time people were watching. This time people were recording. This time it would not be just his word against someone else's. More passengers continued boarding. They had to squeeze past him in the narrow aisle. They looked confused about why a man was just standing there blocking the way. Some glanced at the empty seat 2A and seemed even more confused. A businessman in row 1 looked up from his laptop. "Is everything okay?" he asked. Before the man could answer, the flight attendant returned. Behind her was another woman in a similar uniform but with an extra stripe on her sleeve. This was the supervisor. The supervisor looked tired, as if she had dealt with many problems already that morning. She glanced at the man, then at the flight attendant, then back at the man. "What seems to be the issue here?" she asked. Her tone was more professional than the first attendant's, but there was no warmth in it. The man took a breath. "There is no issue," he said calmly. "I have a first-class ticket for seat 2A. I boarded with the first-class group. I'm simply trying to sit in my assigned seat. Your colleague here seems to think there's a problem, but I can't understand what it might be." He held up his phone again, showing his boarding pass clearly. The supervisor looked at it this time. Her eyes scanned the screen. Seat 2A first class. Everything was correct. But instead of resolving the situation, she looked at the first flight attendant and then back at the man. Something unspoken passed between the two airline employees. "Sir," the supervisor began, her voice taking on an official tone. "We've had some issues with ticket fraud recently. We need to verify your identification." Around them, passengers stirred. Several more phones came out. People were no longer trying to hide that they were recording. This was clearly not a normal situation. The man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He had been patient. He had been polite. He had shown his boarding pass. Now they wanted more. "I see," he said quietly. "And how many other passengers on this flight have you asked to verify their identification after they've already boarded?" The supervisor didn't answer that question. The first flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. The cabin had gone very quiet. Everyone was listening now. Everyone was watching. And many, many people were recording every single word. The supervisor cleared her throat. She looked uncomfortable now, but she was not backing down. "Sir, if you could just show me your driver's license or passport, we can clear this up quickly." The man stood perfectly still for a moment. Behind him, boarding had completely stopped. Passengers waiting in the economy section were craning their necks to see what was causing the delay. The flight attendants in the back of the plane were whispering to each other. "My identification," the man repeated slowly. "You want to see my identification to prove that I am allowed to sit in a seat that my boarding pass clearly shows is assigned to me?" "It's just standard procedure. The first flight," attendant chimed in defensively. "Nothing personal." "Nothing personal," the man echoed. His voice was still calm, but now there was an edge to it. "Tell me something. Did you ask that gentleman to show his identification?" He gestured toward the white businessman in seat 1A, who looked up from his laptop with wide eyes. The supervisor's face flushed slightly. "Sir, please, let's not make this about something it's not." "Then what is it about?" the man asked. "Because from where I'm standing, I have done everything correctly. I purchased a first-class ticket. I checked in online. I boarded at the appropriate time. I found my assigned seat, and yet somehow I'm the only passenger in this entire cabin who is being questioned." The elderly woman across the aisle spoke up again, her voice strong and clear. "I've been sitting here watching people board for 10 minutes. You haven't stopped anyone else?" "Just him. Why is that?" The supervisor turned to her with an annoyed expression. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to mind your own business." "This is my business," the woman shot back. "I'm a passenger on this flight, and I'm watching discrimination happen right in front of my eyes." "That makes it my business," more voices joined in. A man in row 4 said, "She's right. This is wrong. Another passenger called out, "Just let him sit down." The first flight attendant's face was now completely red. She looked at the supervisor as if expecting her to take control of the situation, but the supervisor seemed frozen, unsure of what to do next. The man reached slowly into his jacket pocket. Every movement was deliberate and calm. He pulled out a leather wallet and opened it. He removed his driver's license and held it up. "Here," he said, "my identification, though I should not have to show this to sit in a seat I paid for." The supervisor took the license. She looked at it carefully. Her eyes moved from the photo to the man's face and back again. She was clearly trying to find some reason, any reason, to justify what was happening. The name on the license meant nothing to her. She didn't recognize it. She had no idea who this man was. To her, he was just another passenger who didn't look like he belonged in first class. "Thank you," she said stiffly. She handed the license back. But she didn't apologize. She didn't tell him to sit down. Instead, she said, "I need to verify this with the gate agent." The man's jaw tightened. "You need to verify what exactly? That my driver's license is real? That I am who I say I am? Or that someone like me could actually afford a first-class ticket?" The last question hung in the air like smoke. Several passengers gasped. The woman across the aisle shook her head and said loudly, "This is absolutely shameful." A young woman in row 5 stood up. She was holding her phone up, clearly recording. "Excuse me," she called out, "but I recognize you. You're the founder of Tech Forward, aren't you? You were on the cover of Forbes last month." The man glanced at her briefly and gave a small nod. He didn't say anything, but the confirmation sent a wave of whispers through the cabin. The first flight attendant's eyes widened. The supervisor's mouth opened slightly. They were beginning to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. "Wait," the supervisor said. "Yes," the man interrupted. "I am, and that shouldn't matter. Every passenger deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of who they are or how much money they have or what they look like. But since it seems to matter to you, yes, I am the founder and CEO of a major technology company. I am worth more money than you will see in 10 lifetimes. I donate millions to charity every year, and I still get treated like this." His voice had risen slightly, but he was not yelling. He was simply speaking clearly and firmly. The cabin was absolutely silent now except for his words. "I fly first class because I can afford it," he continued. "I have platinum status with your airline because I fly over 100,000 miles a year. I have been a loyal customer for more than a decade. And yet here I am, standing in the aisle, being interrogated about whether I belong here. Why? What about me made you think I didn't belong? What made you question my ticket when you didn't question anyone else's?" No one answered. The two flight attendants stood there, their faces pale. They knew exactly what he was implying. They knew exactly what they had done. But they had gone too far to back down now. The supervisor tried to recover. "Sir, I apologize if there was any misunderstanding. But as I said, we've had issues with ticket fraud and we have to check." "Stop," the man said firmly. "Just stop. Don't insult my intelligence with excuses. We both know what this is. Everyone on this plane knows what this is." He gestured around the cabin at all the watching faces, all the recording phones. A businessman in row 3 stood up. He was a white man in an expensive suit. "I've been flying for 30 years, he said loudly. "I have never once been asked to show my identification after boarding, not once. This is discrimination, plain and simple." Another passenger, a woman in row 6, added, "I'm a lawyer. What's happening here could be a violation of civil rights laws." The supervisor looked panicked now. This was spiraling out of control. She had expected the man to either back down or cause a scene that would justify removing him from the flight. Instead, he had remained perfectly calm while other passengers rallied to his defense. "Perhaps we should start over," the supervisor tried. "I think there's been a miscommunication." "No," the man said. "There has been no miscommunication. You communicated very clearly what you think of me, what you assumed about me, and now everyone has seen it." He looked around at all the phones pointed in his direction. Dozens of them, all recording, all capturing every word and every moment of this humiliating encounter. "I want to speak to the captain," he said. "Right now." The first flight attendant finally found her voice again. "Sir, the captain is preparing for departure. He's very busy." "I don't care how busy he is," the man replied. "Either you get him out here or I'm getting off this plane. And when I do, I'm going straight to the media with my story and all of this video footage. So you need to decide right now how you want this to end." The supervisor and the first flight attendant exchanged glances. They were trapped. If they forced him off the plane, it would look even worse. The videos would go viral. The airline would face a massive public relations disaster. But if they backed down now, they would have to admit they were wrong. More passengers began speaking up. "Let him sit down," someone shouted. "You're being ridiculous," another called out. "This is taking too long," a man near the back complained. The supervisor made a decision. "I'll get the captain," she said quietly. She turned and hurried toward the cockpit. The first flight attendant stood there awkwardly, not knowing what to do or say. The man remained standing in the aisle, his face composed but his eyes showing the strain of maintaining his calm in the face of such blatant disrespect. The elderly woman across the aisle spoke to him directly. "I'm so sorry this is happening to you," she said. "It's disgraceful." The man nodded at her gratefully. "Thank you," he said quietly. A few minutes later, the supervisor returned. Behind her was a man in a captain's uniform. He looked annoyed at being pulled away from his pre-flight checks. But when he saw the crowd of passengers with phones out and the tense atmosphere in the cabin, his expression changed. "What's going on here?" the captain asked. Before the flight attendants could speak, several passengers started talking at once, explaining what they had witnessed. The captain held up his hand for silence. Then he looked at the man standing in the aisle. "Sir, I'm Captain Richardson. Can you tell me what happened?" The man took a breath and explained calmly and clearly. He showed his boarding pass. He explained how he had been questioned and asked for additional identification. He pointed out that no other passenger had been treated this way. The captain listened. His face grew more serious with each word. When the man finished, the captain turned to his flight attendants. "Is this true?" he asked them. They both started talking at once, making excuses, but the captain cut them off. "Yes or no? Did you single out this passenger and demand to see his identification after he had already boarded with a valid boarding pass?" The supervisor hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but we were just what?" The captain interrupted. His voice was hard now. He looked around at all the passengers watching and recording. He knew this was already a disaster. The captain stood in the aisle, looking from his flight attendants to the businessman and back again. The entire first-class cabin was watching. The silence was heavy and uncomfortable. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. "Sir," the captain said, turning to the businessman, "on behalf of this airline, I apologize. This should never have happened. Please take your seat." The man nodded slowly. He picked up his briefcase from where it still sat on his seat. And finally, after nearly 20 minutes of standing in the aisle, he sat down. But his face showed that the damage was already done. An apology could not erase what had happened. It could not take away the humiliation of being singled out and questioned in front of dozens of strangers. The captain turned to his flight attendants. "We'll discuss this after the flight," he said quietly, but his voice carried a clear warning. Both women looked at the floor. As the captain walked back to the cockpit, the first flight attendant and supervisor moved away quickly. They disappeared toward the back of the plane, their faces red with embarrassment and anger. The first flight attendant was visibly shaking. She knew she had made a terrible mistake. The other passengers slowly settled into their seats, but people kept looking at the businessman. Some looked sympathetic, others looked angry on his behalf, and many kept their phones out, still recording or typing furiously on social media. The young woman who had recognized him earlier leaned forward from her seat in row 5. "Excuse me," she said. "I just want you to know that what happened to you was wrong. Completely wrong. And I recorded the whole thing. If you need the video for any reason, I'll send it to you." "Me too," said another passenger. "I got everything on video." "So did I," said a man across the aisle. Soon, several other passengers were offering their recordings. They gave him their email addresses and phone numbers. They wanted him to know that he had witnesses, that he was not alone, that people had seen what really happened. The elderly woman across the aisle caught his eye. "I've been flying for 40 years, she said. "I have never seen anything so disgraceful. That wasn't about security or fraud. That was about prejudice, pure and simple." The businessman nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly. Thank you all. It means a lot that you spoke up. A businessman from row 1 turned around in his seat. I've seen you speak at conferences, he said. You're brilliant. The work your company does with education technology is changing lives. You shouldn't have to deal with this kind of treatment anywhere, but especially not in a place where you're a paying customer. More people began recognizing him now. A woman pulled up an article on her phone. This is you, right? From Forbes? The article about the top tech entrepreneurs? The man nodded again. He wasn't someone who liked to draw attention to his achievements. He had built his company from nothing, working 18-hour days for years. He had created thousands of jobs. He had donated millions to schools and charities. But he had always tried to stay humble. He didn't flaunt his wealth or his success, yet here he was, having to use his fame and fortune just to be treated with basic respect on an airplane. One of the passengers, a black woman in her 30s, caught his eye. She gave him a look that said she understood. She had probably experienced similar situations herself, maybe not as publicly, but she knew what it felt like to be assumed to not belong somewhere, to be questioned when others weren't, to be seen as suspicious simply because of the color of her skin. The businessman took a deep breath and pulled out his laptop. He tried to focus on his work. He had an important meeting in Los Angeles in a few hours. He needed to review his presentation. But his hands were shaking slightly as he typed. The adrenaline from the confrontation was still running through his body. Around him, passengers were pulling out their own phones and laptops. But they weren't working. They were posting. Tweet after tweet was going out. Instagram stories were being uploaded. Facebook posts were being written, and every single one included video of what had happened. Can you believe this? One woman typed. Watched a black man get harassed by flight attendants just for sitting in first class. He had a valid ticket. They asked for his ID. They treated him like a criminal. This is 2025, people, another passenger posted on Twitter. Currently on a flight where a black businessman was racially profiled by an airline name here staff. Multiple passengers recorded it. This is unacceptable. Racial profiling, utter discrimination. A businessman in row 3 posted a long Facebook message. I just witnessed something that made me sick to my stomach. A well-dressed black man boarded our flight with a first-class ticket. A flight attendant immediately questioned him, demanded his ID, and treated him like he was trying to scam his way into first class. Turns out he's a billionaire tech CEO, but that shouldn't matter. Every passenger deserves respect. This airline should be ashamed. The posts were already being shared. Within minutes, they were being liked and retweeted hundreds of times, then thousands. The story was spreading fast. One passenger had posted the video on TikTok with the caption, "Flight attendant racially profiles black billionaire. Watch till the end." The video was only 2 minutes long, but it captured the most important moments. The flight attendant's hostile tone, the businessman's calm responses, the captain's eventual intervention, and most importantly, it captured the uncomfortable truth that was obvious to everyone watching. The plane finally began to pull away from the gate. The flight attendants went through their safety demonstration, but it was awkward. Passengers in first class barely paid attention. They were too busy watching the flight attendants whispering to each other and continuing to post on social media. The first flight attendant who had started the whole confrontation was not doing the safety demonstration. She had been sent to work in the back of the plane. Another attendant had taken her place in first class. This new attendant looked nervous. She kept glancing at the businessman, probably wondering what had happened. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the businessman stared out the window. He watched the airport buildings pass by. He was thinking about all the times this had happened before, the times when there were no cameras, the times when no one spoke up for him, the times when he had to just swallow his anger and move on because there was nothing he could do about it. He thought about the college student version of himself who had worked 3 jobs to pay for school. How many times had he been followed in stores? How many times had people assumed he couldn't afford something? How many times had he been treated as a threat rather than a human being? Even after he had become successful, it hadn't stopped. When he bought his first expensive car, a police officer had pulled him over and asked him if the car was really his. When he tried to buy a house in an exclusive neighborhood, the real estate agent had tried to steer him toward more affordable areas. When he walked into business meetings, people sometimes assumed he was the assistant, not the CEO. Success had bought him many things, but it had not bought him freedom from prejudice. The plane reached the runway and began to accelerate. The engines roared as they lifted off the ground. The businessman closed his eyes. He was exhausted, and the flight had barely begun. But back on the ground, in airports and homes and offices across the country, his story was taking off even faster than the plane. The videos were going viral. News organizations were picking up the story. Reporters were trying to identify him and contact him for interviews. One of the videos posted by the young woman in row 5 already had over 1 million views. The comment section was exploding with reactions. "This is absolutely disgusting," one person wrote. "How is this still happening in 2025? I will never fly this airline again," another promised. "That flight attendant should be fired immediately," someone demanded. "This man is literally a billionaire and they still treated him like a criminal. Imagine how they treat regular black passengers," another person pointed out. The hashtag that was emerging was "Justice for First Class." People were using it to share their own stories of discrimination while traveling. Black passengers, Latino passengers, Muslim passengers, and others were coming forward with similar experiences. The businessman's story had opened a floodgate. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the story had been picked up by major news outlets. CNN was running a breaking news segment. MSNBC had brought on a civil rights lawyer to discuss the legal implications. Fox News was covering the story, though with different commentary. Local news stations in New York and Los Angeles were both preparing segments. The airline's corporate communications team was in full panic mode. Their phones were ringing constantly. Their social media accounts were being flooded with angry comments. Their stock price was beginning to drop as investors worried about the public relations disaster. Back on the plane, the businessman opened his laptop again. He had email notifications from his assistant, his lawyer, and several friends who had seen the videos online. They were all asking if he was okay and what they could do to help. He wrote back to his assistant first. "I'm fine. We'll talk when I land. Please don't schedule any interviews until we've discussed strategy." To his lawyer, he wrote, "You've probably seen the videos by now. Let's talk about our options when I'm back on the ground." While the plane was still in the air, the internet was exploding. What had started as a few passengers posting videos had turned into a massive viral moment. By the time the flight was halfway to Los Angeles, the story had reached every corner of social media. The hashtag, Justice for First Class, was now trending worldwide on Twitter. Over 5 million people had used it in just 3 hours. The original videos had been viewed more than 20 million times combined. New people were discovering the story every minute, sharing it with their followers and adding their own commentary. On Twitter, celebrities were weighing in. A famous actor with 30 million followers posted, "Just watch the video of what happened on that flight. I'm sick to my stomach. This is exactly the kind of systemic racism that we need to fight against. That man deserved respect, not suspicion." Do Better Airlines, a popular musician, tweeted, "I've experienced this too. Flying first class while black is apparently a crime. The look of shock when I pull out my ticket. The questions. The assumptions. It's exhausting and it needs to stop." A well-known athlete added, "This video is hard to watch because it's so familiar. How many times have I been stopped, questioned, or made to feel like I don't belong? Too many to count." Sending solidarity to this brother. On Instagram, influencers with millions of followers were posting the video to their stories. Each one added their own message of outrage and support. Their young audiences, many experiencing this issue for the first time, were shocked and angry. They were learning about racial profiling through this real documented example. TikTok was where the story really exploded among younger viewers. The original video had been stitched and duetted thousands of times. Content creators were making response videos, explaining the history of discrimination in travel, and calling for change. One video that showed a split screen comparing how the businessman was treated versus how white passengers walked on board without question had 15 million views. Facebook was seeing a different kind of conversation. Older users were sharing the video with long, heartfelt posts about their own experiences or what they had witnessed. Parents were using it as a teaching moment with their children. Discussion groups were debating the issue in hundreds of comments. News organizations were scrambling to cover the story. Their websites crashed from the traffic as millions of people clicked on articles about the incident. Television news programs interrupted their regular programming to show the videos and discuss what had happened. On CNN, a panel of experts was discussing the incident. A civil rights attorney explained, "What we're seeing here is a clear example of racial profiling. This gentleman had done everything right. He had a valid ticket. He boarded at the appropriate time, but he was singled out for additional screening based solely on how he looked. That's discrimination, plain and simple." A former airline employee added context. "In my 20 years working for airlines, I saw this happen more often than people realize. Flight attendants and gate agents sometimes make assumptions about who belongs in first class based on race. It's usually not explicit or intentional, but it comes from deep-seated biases. This video just captured what many passengers of color experience regularly." MSNBC brought on the businessman's biography, showing clips of his speeches and interviews. They highlighted his achievements, his philanthropy, and his impact on the tech industry. One host said, "This is a man who has created thousands of jobs, donated millions to education, and revolutionized how students learn online. And yet he couldn't sit in a seat he paid for without being harassed." What does that tell us about where we are as a society? Major newspapers were rushing to publish their own articles. The New York Times website featured a long piece titled "When Success Isn't Enough: Racial Profiling in First Class." The Washington Post ran an article called "Caught On Camera: The Everyday Discrimination That Black Americans Face." The Los Angeles Times published an opinion piece by a civil rights leader calling for systematic changes in how airlines train their staff. Business news outlets were covering the story from a different angle. They focused on the airline's response and the potential financial impact. Bloomberg reported that the airline stock had dropped 3% in morning trading. Forbes published an article about the businessman's incredible success story and how this incident highlighted persistent inequality even at the highest levels of achievement. International news organizations picked up the story too. The BBC, Al Jazeera, and other global outlets ran segments about the incident, often connecting it to broader conversations about race in America. The story was being discussed in London, Paris, Tokyo, Sydney, and cities around the world. Back in the United States, local news stations in every major city were covering the story. They interviewed local civil rights leaders, showed the videos, and asked viewers to share their own experiences. The phones at news stations were ringing constantly with people wanting to tell their stories. Social media analysts were amazed at how quickly the story had spread. One expert said in an interview, "This is one of the fastest growing viral stories we've seen this year." The combination of clear video evidence, a sympathetic victim, and a topic that resonates with millions of people created perfect conditions for viral spread. By tomorrow, it will have been seen by hundreds of millions of people globally. The airline's social media accounts were under siege. Every post they made, regardless of the topic, was flooded with comments about the incident. People were demanding answers. They wanted to know what the airline was going to do. They wanted to see consequences. "Fire those flight attendants," one person demanded in the comments. "I'm canceling all my future flights with you." Another wrote, "Do you train your staff to racially profile passengers?" Someone asked, "This is disgusting." "I'm switching airlines," another declared. The airline's customer service team was overwhelmed. They were receiving thousands of complaints and angry messages. Their phone lines were jammed. Their email inbox was exploding. Every customer service representative was dealing with furious customers who wanted to know how the airline could let this happen. The airline's CEO was in an emergency meeting with his executive team. They were watching the videos over and over, reading the social media posts and trying to figure out how to respond. Their PR team was drafting statements, but nothing seemed adequate for the scale of the crisis. "We need to say something," the head of communications insisted. "The silence is making it worse, but what do we say?" Another executive asked. "If we apologize, we're admitting guilt. That opens us up to lawsuits. If we don't apologize, we look heartless," someone else pointed out. "Have you seen these videos? It's clear what happened. We can't spin this." While they debated, the public outrage continued to build. Organizations began getting involved. The NAACP released a statement calling for a full investigation. The National Urban League demanded policy changes across the airline industry. The American Civil Liberties Union offered their legal services to the businessman if he decided to sue. Corporate sponsors of the airline were getting nervous. They didn't want to be associated with a company accused of racial discrimination. Some were quietly discussing whether to end their partnerships. Others were issuing their own statements, distancing themselves from the airline's actions. Boycott movements were forming online. People were organizing campaigns to hit the airline where it hurt, their bottom line. They created websites listing alternative airlines. They shared tips on how to cancel flights and get refunds. They encouraged people to post about switching airlines using the hashtag. The businessman's company was also dealing with the aftermath. His employees were proud of how he had handled himself. They were angry on his behalf. Many of them shared the videos with messages of support for their CEO. The company's social media accounts saw a surge in positive attention as people learned more about the work they did. Competitors in the airline industry were watching carefully. Some saw an opportunity. One airline quickly released a statement. At our airline, every passenger is treated with dignity and respect regardless of their race, background, or where they sit on the plane. Discrimination has no place in travel. It was a subtle jab at their competitor, and it earned them praise online. By the time the plane was preparing to land in Los Angeles, the story had been viewed over 50 million times across all platforms. It had been shared by major news outlets, celebrities, athletes, politicians, and millions of regular people. It had sparked conversations at dinner tables, in office break rooms, and in school classrooms across the country. The businessman still on the plane had no idea just how big the story had become. His phone had been in airplane mode for the entire flight. He had spent most of the time working on his laptop, trying to focus on his presentation and push the incident out of his mind. Other passengers on the plane kept glancing at him. Some wanted to say something but weren't sure what. The elderly woman who had spoken up earlier caught his eye before landing and gave him an encouraging nod. He nodded back, grateful for her support. As the plane descended toward Los Angeles, the flight attendant who had confronted him was in the back galley, talking in hushed, worried tones with her supervisor. They had heard from other flight attendants about the social media explosion. They knew they were in serious trouble. The supervisor's hands were shaking as she sent text messages to her union representative. The captain made the announcement to prepare for landing. Passengers put away their laptops and phones. The businessman looked out the window at the sprawling city below. He had no idea that in a few minutes, when he turned his phone back on, he would be greeted with hundreds of messages. He had no idea that his face was on the front page of news websites around the world. He had no idea that millions of people were talking about him, supporting him and demanding justice on his behalf. The plane touched down smoothly. As it taxied to the gate, passengers began turning on their phones. Immediately, notification sounds filled the cabin. Dings, buzzes, and chimes as messages and alerts came flooding in. The businessman turned on his phone. The screen lit up with notification after notification. Messages from friends, family, colleagues, lawyers, reporters, and complete strangers. His social media mentions were in the thousands. His email inbox showed hundreds of unread messages. He scrolled through them, his eyes widening with each swipe. He clicked on one of the videos and watched himself standing in the aisle, remaining calm while being questioned. He read the comments. He saw the hashtag. He realized what had happened. This was no longer just his personal experience. This had become a national conversation. This had become a moment that would be remembered and referenced for years to come. This had become bigger than he ever imagined it could be. The plane came to a complete stop at the gate. Passengers began gathering their belongings, but many were distracted by their phones. They were reading articles, watching videos, and messaging friends about what they had witnessed. The businessman remained seated, still scrolling through the flood of notifications on his phone. His assistant had sent him a dozen urgent messages. Your phone is going to explode when you turn it on. The videos are everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, Fox, all of them. Call me as soon as you land. His lawyer had written, We need to talk immediately. I've been contacted by multiple media outlets. The airline's legal team has also reached out. Don't make any statements until we speak. His company's PR director sent, Boss, this is huge. I've turned down 50 interview requests in the last hour. We need a strategy meeting ASAP. Even his mother had texted, Baby, I saw the videos. Are you okay? Call me when you land. I'm so proud of how you handled yourself. The businessman took a deep breath. He had been through difficult situations before. He had dealt with business crises, tough negotiations, and public scrutiny. But this felt different. This was personal in a way that business never was. As passengers began filing off the plane, several stopped to speak with him. A middle-aged man said, "Thank you for staying calm up there. You showed real dignity." A young woman told him, "You've inspired me to always speak up when I see injustice." The elderly woman who had defended him squeezed his shoulder gently and said, "You're going to change things with this." "I just know it." When the businessman finally stood to leave, he noticed airport security waiting at the gate. His heart sank for a moment, wondering if there was more trouble. But the security officers simply nodded respectfully, and one said, "Sir, we're here to escort you through the airport. There are some reporters waiting, and we want to make sure you can get where you need to go safely." He nodded gratefully and followed them. As they walked through the terminal, people recognized him, some from the videos that had gone viral, others because they knew who he was from business news. Several people pulled out their phones to take pictures. A few called out words of support. "We've got your back," one man shouted. "Stay strong," a woman encouraged. The businessman made it to the curb where a car was waiting for him. As he climbed in, a cluster of reporters rushed forward, shouting questions. "Sir, how do you feel about what happened? Will you be taking legal action against the airline? What do you want people to know? Are you surprised by the response?" He didn't answer any questions. He simply got in the car and it pulled away. He needed time to think, to process, to plan. The driver took him to his hotel in silence, respecting his need for quiet. Meanwhile, back in New York, the airline's headquarters was in chaos. The CEO had decided they needed to release a statement immediately. After hours of debate, they published a message on social media and sent it to news outlets. It read, "We are aware of an incident that occurred on Flight 447 from New York to Los Angeles this morning. We take all concerns seriously and are conducting a thorough investigation. We are committed to providing excellent service to all our passengers." The response was instant and brutal. "That's it? That's your response?" One person tweeted. "No apology? No acknowledgement of what actually happened?" Another wrote, "This is the worst PR response I've ever seen," a marketing professional posted. "Conducting an investigation?" We all saw the video. "There's nothing to investigate," someone else pointed out. Within an hour, the airline's statement had been shared thousands of times, but not in the way they had hoped. People were mocking it. They were pointing out how inadequate it was. They were using it as evidence that the airline didn't take the issue seriously. The backlash intensified. More people announced they were boycotting the airline. Travel blogs published articles about alternative airlines to use. Corporate clients began canceling their business travel contracts. The financial impact was starting to become very real. By evening, the airline's stock had dropped 5%. Financial analysts were warning that it could fall further. One analyst told Bloomberg, "This isn't just a PR problem anymore. This is affecting their bottom line. Major corporations are reconsidering their travel partnerships. Consumers are actively choosing competitors. The airline needs to take swift and decisive action, or they're looking at a long-term decline in revenue." Employee morale inside the airline was also suffering. Many flight attendants and other staff members were embarrassed by what had happened. They felt that the actions of one person were reflecting badly on all of them. Some took to social media themselves to distance themselves from their colleagues' behavior. One flight attendant posted, "I've worked for this airline for 15 years. What happened on that flight does not represent the values of most of us. We're trained to treat every passenger with respect. Those flight attendants were wrong, period." But others defended their coworkers. The flight attendants union released a statement saying, "We believe in due process. Our members should not be condemned without a fair investigation. While we don't condone discrimination, we also believe there may be context we're not seeing in these videos." This statement only made things worse. People accused the union of trying to excuse racism. The union's social media accounts were flooded with angry responses. Several members of the union publicly disagreed with the statement, saying they didn't want to be associated with defending discrimination. The two flight attendants involved had been placed on administrative leave. They were at home watching the news coverage with growing horror. The first flight attendant, The one who had initially confronted the businessman was devastated. She had never intended for this to happen. She truly believed she had been following proper procedures. But now, seeing the videos, hearing the commentary, and reading the reactions, she was beginning to understand how her actions had looked. Her phone rang constantly. Reporters had somehow gotten her number and were trying to reach her for comment. Her union representative advised her to say nothing. Her lawyer told her the same thing. So she sat in her living room alone, watching her face appear on television screens around the world, being called racist, being condemned, becoming the villain in a story that millions were following. The supervisor, who had been called to handle the situation, was also on leave. She was angry, defensive, and worried about her job. She had worked for the airline for 20 years. She had never had any disciplinary issues before. Now she was facing the possibility of being fired and becoming unhireable in the industry. Back in Los Angeles, the businessman was in his hotel room, watching the news coverage. His team had gathered there with him. His lawyer, his PR director, his assistant, and a few trusted advisors. They were trying to figure out the best path forward. "You could sue," his lawyer said. "You have a strong case for discrimination. The evidence is clear. You'd likely win a significant settlement." Or, his PR director suggested, "You could use this moment to advocate for change. This has become bigger than one incident. You have a platform now. People are listening. You don't owe anyone anything," his assistant pointed out. "You could just move on. Issue a brief statement and let it die down." The businessman listened to all of them. He had been thinking about this since he landed. What did he want? Justice, revenge, change, peace? "I want this to mean something," he finally said. "If I just sue and get money, what does that accomplish? I don't need their money. But maybe I can use this attention to actually change things, to make sure this doesn't keep happening to other people." His team nodded. They began brainstorming ideas. A press conference, a charitable initiative, a campaign for better training. The possibilities were many. While they strategized, more organizations were getting involved in the public conversation. Civil rights groups were calling for federal investigations into airline discrimination. Consumer advocacy organizations were demanding new regulations. Even some members of Congress were speaking out. A senator tweeted, "What happened on that flight is unacceptable. I'm calling for hearings on discrimination in the airline industry. Every American deserves to travel with dignity." A congresswoman announced, "I'm introducing legislation that would require airlines to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training and establish independent review boards for bias complaints." The conversation was expanding beyond just this one incident. People were sharing statistics about discrimination in travel. Studies showed that Black passengers were more likely to be questioned, searched, and removed from flights. Data revealed patterns of unequal treatment that had been ignored for too long. Former passengers came forward with their own stories. A Black doctor described being asked to prove she was really a doctor when she tried to help during a medical emergency on a flight. A Latino businessman shared how he was accused of stealing when he sat in his assigned first-class seat. A Muslim woman talked about being removed from a flight because another passenger felt uncomfortable with her presence. These stories added depth to the conversation. They showed that the businessman's experience was not isolated. It was part of a larger pattern, a system that needed to change. Major corporations that partnered with the airline were facing pressure too. Customers were asking them why they continued to work with an airline that allowed discrimination. Some companies began publicly announcing they were reviewing their relationships with the airline. A major hotel chain released a statement. "We are deeply concerned by the reports of discrimination. We are suspending our promotional partnership with the airline pending a review of their policies and practices." A credit card company that offered airline miles announced, "We are in discussions with the airline about this serious matter. Our company values diversity and inclusion, and we expect the same from our partners." The pressure was coming from all directions. From customers, from partners, from employees, from the media, from politicians, and from advocacy groups. The airline was facing the biggest crisis in its history, and at the center of it all was one man who had simply tried to sit in a seat he had paid for. One man who had remained calm in the face of humiliation. One man whose experience had been captured on video and shared with the world. The businessman looked at his team. "Set up a press conference for tomorrow morning," he said. It's time I spoke about this directly. His team nodded and got to work. The world was waiting to hear what he would say. And whatever he said would shape the next chapter of this rapidly unfolding story. The next morning, a conference room at a downtown Los Angeles hotel was packed with reporters. Cameras lined the back wall. Journalists filled every seat, with more standing along the sides. News networks were broadcasting live. The energy in the room was electric with anticipation. At exactly 10 o'clock, the businessman walked into the room. He wore a dark suit and looked composed, though those who knew him could see the weight of the past 24 hours in his eyes. He took his place behind a podium that had been set up at the front of the room. His lawyer and PR director sat to the side. The room fell silent. Cameras clicked. The red recording lights on video cameras glowed. The world was watching. The businessman looked out at the crowd of reporters. He took a breath and began to speak. Thank you all for being here. Yesterday morning, I boarded a flight from New York to Los Angeles. What should have been a routine business trip became something very different. Many of you have seen the videos. You know what happened, but I want to speak about it in my own words. He paused, gathering his thoughts. When that flight attendant questioned my right to sit in my assigned seat, it was humiliating. When she demanded to see additional identification that no other passenger was asked for, it was demeaning. When she insisted there must be some mistake, despite clear evidence that I belonged there, it was painful. Not because of who I am or what I've accomplished, but because it represented something much bigger than one incident on one flight. The room was absolutely still. Every reporter was listening intently. This wasn't about a ticket or a seat or a misunderstanding. This was about assumptions made based on the color of my skin. This was about being seen as suspicious, as out of place, as not belonging, simply because of how I look. And this is something that millions of Black Americans experience every single day, in all kinds of situations. He continued, his voice growing stronger. I am fortunate. I have resources. I have a platform. I have people who will listen to me. But what about all the people who experience this same treatment and don't have those advantages? What about the Black passenger who gets questioned and has no video proof? What about the person who speaks up and gets removed from the flight? What about all the quiet moments of discrimination that never make the news? Reporters were typing furiously, recording every word. I've spent the last 24 hours thinking about what this moment means. Yes, I could sue. Yes, I could demand that those employees be fired. Yes, I could accept an apology and move on. But I believe this moment calls for something more, something bigger, something that creates real change. He outlined his plan. He was launching a major initiative, immediately funded with $10 million from his personal wealth. The initiative would have three main parts. First, a legal aid fund to help victims of discrimination in travel. Many people couldn't afford lawyers to fight back when they were mistreated. This fund would provide free legal services to anyone who experienced discrimination while traveling, regardless of their race, religion, or background. Second, a training program. He was partnering with civil rights organizations to develop comprehensive anti-bias training, specifically for airline employees. This training would be offered free to any airline that wanted it. It would address unconscious bias, de-escalation techniques, and respectful customer service. Third, a research initiative. He was funding academic studies to examine patterns of discrimination in travel and other industries. The goal was to gather data, identify systemic problems, and develop evidence-based solutions. I don't want my discomfort to be wasted, he said. I want it to lead to something meaningful. I want it to protect others from experiencing what I experienced. I want it to be a catalyst for real, lasting change. As he finished his prepared remarks, he opened the floor to questions. Hands shot up across the room. Do you think the flight attendants should be fired? A reporter from CNN asked. The businessman paused before answering. I think they should be held accountable for their actions. But I also think this is about more than two individuals. This is about systemic issues. Training, culture, policies. I want to see the entire industry change, not just two people lose their jobs. Are you planning to sue the airline? Another reporter asked. My legal team is exploring all options, he replied carefully. But my focus right now is on the initiative I just described. On creating change. How did this make you feel personally? A journalist from a major newspaper asked. The businessman's expression softened slightly. Tired, he said honestly. I'm tired of having to prove I belong. tired of being seen as suspicious, tired of having to work twice as hard to receive half the respect. This incident was just one moment, but it represents a lifetime of similar moments, and I know I'm not alone in feeling this way. A reporter from a business network asked, "What do you want from the airline specifically?" "I want a real commitment to change. Not just a statement. Not just a promise. I want to see actual policy changes, mandatory training, independent oversight, accountability measures. I want them to prove through their actions that this will never happen again." The questions continued for over an hour. The businessman answered each one thoughtfully and directly. He didn't dodge difficult questions. He didn't sugarcoat his feelings. He was honest, articulate, and powerful. When the press conference ended, the footage was immediately shared across every news platform. His words were quoted in articles. His initiative was praised by civil rights leaders. His measured but firm response earned respect even from people who might have disagreed with him politically. One civil rights leader said in an interview later that day, "What he's doing is remarkable. He's using his privilege and his platform to lift up others. He's not just talking about change, he's funding it. He's not just angry, he's constructive. This is leadership." A political commentator added, "Love him or hate his politics, you have to admire how he handled this. He stayed calm when provoked. He's channeling his anger into positive action. And he's keeping the focus on systemic issues rather than individual revenge. That's maturity and wisdom." But not everyone was supportive. Some critics argued he was overreacting. Conservative commentators suggested he was playing the race card. A few social media users accused him of seeking attention. One controversial talk show host said, "Maybe the flight attendant was just doing her job. Maybe this wasn't about race at all. Why does everything have to be about discrimination?" But these critics were in the minority. The videos were too clear. The evidence was too obvious. Most people could see exactly what had happened and why it was wrong. Meanwhile, the airline was scrambling to respond. They had watched the press conference live. They knew they needed to do something dramatic to stop the bleeding. By early afternoon, the airline's CEO held his own press conference. He looked tired and stressed. The past day had clearly taken its toll on him. "I want to start by offering my sincere and heartfelt apology," he began. "What happened on Flight 447 was unacceptable. It does not represent our values. It does not represent the culture we strive to create, and it should never have happened." He announced immediate changes. The 2 flight attendants involved had been terminated, not just suspended. The airline was implementing mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees, starting immediately. They were creating an independent review board to investigate discrimination complaints. They were revising their policies on passenger interactions. "We failed," the CEO said bluntly. "We failed that passenger. We failed our other customers. We failed ourselves. But we are committed to doing better. We are committed to learning from this. We are committed to change." The CEO also announced that the airline would donate $5 million to civil rights organizations working on discrimination issues. It was a clear attempt to show they were serious about making amends. The response to the airline's announcements was mixed. Some people felt it was too little, too late. Others appreciated that they were taking concrete action. Many said they would judge the airline by their future behavior, not their current promises. The businessman watched the airline CEO's press conference from his hotel room. His team was with him, monitoring reactions across social media and news outlets. "What do you think?" his PR director asked. "I think it's a start," he said carefully. "But talk is cheap. I want to see if they actually follow through." That evening, more developments emerged. Several other airlines, wanting to avoid similar incidents, announced their own policy reviews and training programs. The competitive pressure was forcing the entire industry to examine its practices. Major advocacy organizations praised the businessman's initiative and pledged to work with him. The NAACP offered to help develop the training program. The American Civil Liberties Union agreed to help run the legal aid fund. Academic institutions expressed interest in conducting the research studies. Former passengers from the flight began speaking out publicly. The elderly woman who had defended him gave an interview to a national news program. "I've never been so disgusted in my life," she said. "That man showed more grace and dignity than anyone I've ever seen. He deserved better. We all deserve better." The young woman who first recognized him and posted one of the viral videos was interviewed on a morning show. "I'm glad I recorded it," she said. "Because without that video, who would have believed him? How many times does this happen when there's no camera? That's what really scares me." Social media continued to buzz with the story, but now the conversation was shifting. People were moving from outrage to action. They were sharing the businessman's initiative. They were discussing what they could do in their own lives to fight discrimination. They were having difficult but necessary conversations about race and bias. Hashtags like "Young Change Not Just Apologies" and "Travel with Dignity" began trending. People shared stories of times they had witnessed discrimination and regretted not speaking up. Others shared stories of times they had intervened and made a difference. The businessman spent the evening reading messages of support. Thousands of people had reached out to him. Some shared their own stories of discrimination. Others thanked him for speaking up. Many pledged to support his initiative. One message particularly moved him. It was from a young black college student who wrote, "I watched your press conference with my little brother. He's 10 years old. When it was over, he said to me, 'When I grow up, I want to be like him. Strong but not angry, hurt but not bitter, sad but still hopeful.' Thank you for showing us how to turn pain into purpose." The businessman saved that message. It reminded him why he was doing this. Not for attention, not for revenge, but to create a world where that 10-year-old boy wouldn't have to experience what he had experienced. Where being black and successful wouldn't make you automatically suspect. Where everyone could travel with dignity. As the sun set on the second day of this crisis, the story was still evolving. But the direction was becoming clear. This wasn't going to be just another viral moment that faded away. This was going to be a turning point, a catalyst for real change. And the businessman, who had simply tried to sit in a seat he paid for, had become the face of that change. 3 weeks had passed since that morning on Flight 447. The story had dominated news cycles, sparked national conversations, and created waves of change across multiple industries. Now the pieces were falling into place, and the results of those chaotic first days were becoming clear. The airline had followed through on their promises, though it hadn't been easy. The mandatory anti-discrimination training program was now underway. Every single employee, from pilots to gate agents to flight attendants, was required to complete an intensive 8-hour course. The training covered unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, conflict de-escalation, and respectful customer service. The sessions were not easy. Some employees resisted, feeling defensive or attacked. But the trainers, working with the civil rights organizations that the businessman had partnered with, handled the resistance skillfully. They didn't lecture or shame. Instead, they facilitated honest conversations. They shared real stories. They helped employees understand how their assumptions could hurt people. One flight attendant, a white woman who had worked for the airline for 12 years, said after completing the training, "I didn't think I was biased. I thought I treated everyone the same. But this training made me realize how many assumptions I make without even thinking about it. How I might smile more warmly at some passengers than others. How I might question some people more quickly than others. It was uncomfortable to realize, but I'm grateful for the awareness." The independent review board was also established. It was made up of civil rights experts, former airline employees, and community leaders. Any passenger who felt they had experienced discrimination could file a complaint directly with this board, which operated separately from the airline's regular customer service. The board had the power to investigate, make recommendations, and even impose penalties on employees who violated anti-discrimination policies. The 2 flight attendants who had been at the center of the incident had been fired, as the CEO had announced. The first flight attendant, who had initially confronted the businessman, released a public statement 2 weeks after the incident. It read, "I want to apologize sincerely for my actions on that flight. I made assumptions that were wrong and hurtful. I let my biases guide my behavior and I caused real harm. I am deeply sorry. I am using this as an opportunity to examine my own prejudices and to become a better person. I hope that my mistake can serve as a lesson to others about the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity." Some people accepted her apology. Others felt it was too little, too late. The businessman himself never responded to it publicly, though privately he told his close friends that he appreciated the acknowledgement, even if it couldn't undo what had happened. The businessman's initiative was growing rapidly. The Legal Aid Fund had already helped 15 people file discrimination complaints against various airlines. Some cases were settled quietly. Others were moving forward to trial. The fund had a team of lawyers working full-time on these cases, all funded by the businessman's donation and additional contributions from supporters. The training program that his team had developed was being used not just by the airline involved in the incident, but by 5 other major airlines as well. 2 hotel chains had also requested the program for their staff. A rental car company was interested. The program was becoming an industry standard. The research initiative had begun collecting data. Academic teams at 3 universities were conducting studies on discrimination patterns in travel. Early results confirmed what many people of color had long known. They were more likely to be stopped, questioned, searched, and removed from flights than white passengers, even when controlling for other factors. But beyond the specific initiative, the impact was spreading in unexpected ways. Other companies in different industries were examining their own practices. Retail stores were reviewing their security protocols. Banks were looking at how they treated customers of different races. Hotels were training their staff on bias awareness. The conversation had gone national. Schools were using the incident as a teaching moment, discussing discrimination, bias, and civil rights with students. Churches and community groups were holding discussions about race and dignity. The businessman's press conference was shown in diversity training sessions across the country. The airline's stock had initially continued to fall, dropping as much as 8% in the week after the incident. But then it began to recover as the company demonstrated its commitment to change. 3 weeks later, the stock was only down 2% from where it had been before the incident. Analysts credited the company's swift and comprehensive response for preventing a longer-term decline. Customer sentiment was slowly improving too. Many people who had sworn they would never fly the airline again were reconsidering. They were watching to see if the changes were real and lasting. Some were even giving the airline credit for taking responsibility and making meaningful reforms. But the businessman knew that the real test would come over time. Would the airline maintain these standards 6 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now? Or would the policies slowly erode once the public attention faded? To help ensure lasting change, he had worked with civil rights organizations to create an annual audit system. Independent evaluators would regularly assess airline practices, interview employees and passengers, and publish public reports on how well airlines were following through on their anti-discrimination commitments. The first audits would happen in 6 months. The businessman himself had returned to his regular life, though it would never quite be the same. He was recognized more often now. People approached him in airports, on streets, in restaurants. Most were supportive, thanking him for speaking up and making a difference. A few were critical, telling him he had overreacted or played the victim. He handled it all with the same calm dignity he had shown on that flight. He listened to people. He answered questions when appropriate. He declined to engage with those who just wanted to argue. He focused on the work. His company had seen a surge in positive attention. Sales had increased. Job applications had flooded in from people who wanted to work for a leader who stood up for what was right. Investors had praised his handling of the situation. His company's reputation had never been stronger, but for him the most meaningful impact was in the stories people shared with him. A black teenager who said she felt more confident flying alone after seeing how he had handled himself. A parent who said he had used the incident to teach his children about dignity and resilience. A flight attendant of color who said the training had made her workplace feel safer and more respectful. 1 month after the incident, a surprising development occurred. 3 other major airlines, wanting to be seen as leaders on this issue, announced they were voluntarily adopting similar policies to those the first airline had implemented. They introduced their own independent review boards. They mandated comprehensive anti-bias training. They created clear procedures for how to handle discrimination complaints. Industry experts called it the dignity standard. It was becoming a benchmark that airlines were expected to meet. Consumer advocacy groups began rating airlines based on their anti-discrimination policies and practices. Travel websites added this information to their flight booking tools, allowing customers to choose airlines based on their values. The businessman was invited to speak at a major airline industry conference. He stood before a room full of executives, pilots, flight attendants, and other airline professionals. He shared his story again, but this time he focused on the path forward. What happened to me wasn't unique, he told them. It happens to someone somewhere on some flight every single day. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Because every time you allow discrimination to happen, every time you look the other way, every time you make excuses, you are sending a message about who is welcome and who is not. You are deciding what kind of industry you want to be part of. He continued, I believe most people in this room want to do the right thing. I believe most of you became flight attendants because you wanted to help people, to make travel better, to be part of connecting the world. Don't let bias get in the way of that mission. Don't let assumptions prevent you from treating every single passenger with the respect they deserve. The speech received a standing ovation. Afterward, dozens of airline employees approached him to share their own commitments to change and their gratitude for his leadership on this issue. Congress held hearings on discrimination in travel. As promised by several lawmakers, the businessman testified, along with civil rights leaders, former airline employees, and other victims of discrimination. The hearings led to proposed legislation that would strengthen protections against discrimination and create federal standards for anti-bias training in the travel industry. 6 weeks after the incident, the businessman received a letter. It was from a 10-year-old boy, the little brother of the college student who had sent him a message after his press conference. The boy had drawn a picture of an airplane with a rainbow and the words "Everyone belongs" written across the top. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, he had written, "Thank you for showing me that you can be strong and kind at the same time." The businessman hung that picture in his office. It reminded him every day why the difficult moment on that flight had been worth it, why the uncomfortable press conference had been necessary, why the hard work of creating change mattered. The story had become a case study in business schools about crisis management and corporate responsibility. It was discussed in law schools as an example of discrimination and civil rights. It was examined in communications courses as a masterclass in public response to controversy. It was referenced in diversity training sessions across countless industries. But for the businessman, it was simply a reminder that every moment is an opportunity. An opportunity to stand up or stay silent. An opportunity to create change or accept the status quo. An opportunity to turn personal pain into public progress. The flight attendant's hostile questions hadn't been about one man's ticket. They had been about centuries of prejudice and assumptions. The viral videos hadn't just shown one incident. They had revealed a pattern that needed to be broken. And the businessman's response hadn't just been about personal justice. It had been about collective dignity. As the initial fury and attention began to fade into the background, replaced by new stories and new controversies, the systems that had been put in place remained. The training continued. The review boards kept working. The legal aid fund kept helping people. The research studies continued gathering data. Real change, the businessman had learned, didn't come from one viral moment. It came from sustained effort, from building institutions, from changing policies, from educating people, from holding companies accountable over time. He would continue flying. He would continue sitting in first-class seats that he had earned and paid for. And now, because of what he had endured and how he had responded, thousands of other passengers would be able to do the same with a little more dignity, a little more respect, and a little more justice. The incident on Flight 447 had started as one man's humiliation. But it had become something much larger, a movement for change, a demand for dignity, a reminder that everyone, regardless of the color of their skin, deserves to be treated with respect. And while the work was far from finished, and discrimination would not disappear overnight, the businessman could look at what had been accomplished and feel that his discomfort had not been wasted. His pain had been transformed into purpose. His story had become a catalyst for change. As he boarded his next flight a few months later, a flight attendant greeted him with a genuine smile and said simply, "Welcome aboard, sir. We're glad to have you with us, no questions, no suspicion, no assumptions, just respect." He smiled back and took his seat. It was a small moment, but it represented something important: progress, change, hope, and that, he thought, was worth fighting for.